This is entitled How Ice Ages Happen. So this is a complete Ice Age paper of 36 pages in 10 minutes. I promise you, it's that simple. Why did I get involved with this? Well, because of that diagram we saw before, that when CO2 is high, the world cools, and when CO2 is low, the world warms. How does that happen? Totally the opposite of what people are trying to tell us within the climate community. So there was a problem. And the problem was that nobody has explained how ice ages are modulated. We've always had an idea about how they're modulated, how they're controlled, but no one knew the full details. So I wrote this climate paper, Modulation of Ice Ages by Dust and Albedo Feedbacks, by myself. It's freely available online as a PDF, so you can pick it up and have a look at it. Most of these papers cost $35, but this one is free. So let's have a look at that same diagram we saw before, just as a quick reminder, because this is what set me off on this little task. We've got 800,000 years of data here. This is all from the Epica ice core down in Antarctica. So this is ice core data. And what do we see here? Well, correlation does not imply causation. We've already seen that. If you want to imply causation, you need a rationale. You need evidence for causation, which they don't have. And we could say that when CO2 is high, the world cools, and when CO2 is low, the world warms, which is the opposite of what we've been told. So how do we explain this? So we could say, yeah, quickly here, high CO2 causes cooling, low CO2 causes warming, and this would not happen if CO2 was a very strong greenhouse gas. This goes against the CO2 narrative. So let's look at orbital cycles. You don't need to know how these work. I'm just going to give you a few names so you're familiar with the names. We have the precession, it's going to do it all at the same time. Precession of the Earth's axis, that's the wobble of the Earth. The obliquity of the Earth's axis, that's the tilt angle of the Earth. The eccentricity of the Earth's orbit, that's how far we are from the Sun, which does change. And apsidal precession, don't worry about that. But if you mix all of those together, you get Milankovitch cycles, which you've probably heard of, devised by Mr. Milankovitch back in the early 20th century. Very clever, because he didn't have a computer to do this. It was all done with slide rules. Anyway, what is the Milankovitch cycle? I call it the Great Year, because that's nice and descriptive. Because it's exactly, well, not exactly, it's very similar to an annual year. In an annual year, you have summer in the north and winter in the south. And then you have winter in the north and summer in the south. Well, the Great Year, the Milankovitch cycle, does exactly the same, except it's 23,000 years long. It's a very long, great year. But of course, that can affect climate because the amount of energy hitting the northern latitudes increases by 20%. That's a lot. So it will affect climate. So yeah, similar to an annual year, but longer. So we've always known for 100 years that orbital cycles are something to do with the Ice Age cycle. So let's look at the graph of temperature versus orbital cycles during the Ice Ages. Here it is. So we have temperature in red, very much the same as we've seen before, and this is going back 450,000 years. So each peak in this red is an interglacial, a warm period. Note how small the interglacials are. They're very, very small. Most of the time we're in Ice Age conditions. And this is our current interglacial, known as the Holocene. It's slightly longer because of orbital cycles. The blue line is the Great Year, the Milankovitch cycle. And it goes up and down, and each of these peaks in the blue will be 23,000 years apart, roughly. They do change a little bit, but not by much. So what can we see from this? Well, we can see that every time we have a great summer in the northern hemisphere, we end up with an interglacial. So an interglacial is something to do with the extra warming we get from a great summer. But the problem was, the thing that's never been explained before, dare I say before I came along, is that we have an awful lot of great summers that do not produce any warming. Loads of them. In fact, most of them don't provide any warming. Only one or two of them do. So that is a real problem. Why is the temperature response selective? How can you get a selective response to a standard orbital cycle? CO2 can't be the feedback because it's not operating in that fashion. It's following temperature. It is not changing in a fashion that would make that happen. The true feedback controlling ice ages is ice albedo. Albedo is the reflectivity. So what's albedo? Let's have a look at albedo. It's a very, very simple concept. Here is an ice sheet, and it's nice and bright and white. And if we get the sun to shine on it, all of the energy is going to be reflected away. And by all, I mean sort of all. It's like 95% of the energy will get reflected back into space, basically. So it's not going to warm the Earth. How do we stop it doing that? Because this is like during the peak of an ice age when there's loads and loads of ice all over the northern hemisphere. And it's acting as a very, very strong cooling agent. A cooling feedback, you might say. How do we stop it doing that? Well, it's not going to do it one at a time, is it? Oh, it's going to be forever doing this. It's supposed to all come down at once, but there we go. How do we stop it doing this? Well, we cover the ice with soot or dust. And that way, the insolation, as we call it, the sun's rays can be absorbed by these little spots of soot and warm the surface and melt the ice sheets. There we go, at last. Okay, so that is albedo. What we need to do to end an ice age is we need to cover the ice sheets with dust. How do we do that? Well, we're back to this old graph again. Plants and CO2. So again, the difference between all of these plants is the amount of CO2 they're getting. More CO2, the stronger the plants grow, especially in the Sahel. So at the Ice Age maximum, CO2 came down to 190 parts per million, which is almost at the death zone for plants. And at altitude, so up on the Asian plateau near the Gobi, the equivalent CO2 came down to 150 parts per million. That's well within the death zone for C3 plants. And so they all died. So low CO2 equals plant death equals CO2 deserts, which we're not familiar with because nobody mentions CO2 deserts. But if you don't have enough CO2, you will form a desert. And CO deserts equals dust. That's where the dust comes from. And dusty ice sheets, if you can get that dust and you can transport it onto the northern ice sheets, cover them in dust, they will melt. So let's have a look at the graph of CO2 versus dust. Again, this comes from the Epica ice core. That's the European ice core down in Antarctica. They drilled, I don't know, it's about 3 kilometers down or something. Anyway, a long way down. So they got 800,000 years of data going all the way back there. And you can separate out CO2 and they can find the dust in the ice core as well. So we get a graph of CO2 and dust. Now, the CO2, this is reflecting all of the interglacials, of course. And what do we see from this? Well, every time CO2 is low, we get high dust. Why do we get high dust? Well, because CO2 deserts are being formed. by the low CO2. Not enough CO2, the plants die, we get CO2 deserts, and that's why we get high dust. And we get a lot of dust for a long time. And that will have an effect on temperature. So let's look at temperature versus dust. Again, this is from the Epica ice core. Temperature versus dust. And every time we get high dust, we get an interglacial. We get warming. So every interglacial there has ever been in the last million years has been preceded by 10,000 years of dust. And it's the dust on the ice sheets that causes the warming, not the CO2, which is the standard argument that they're still trying to push in all of the climate papers. But that is what causes interglacial warming. And this has never been published before. Mine was the first paper to publish this idea that it is low CO2, because that's the problem. This is why they couldn't find out what the true mechanism was, because they're all looking at CO2. But in reality, interglacial warming is not due to CO2 directly. It's only indirectly via dust and in the opposite sense. So it's low CO2 that causes warming. This is why this could not be discovered previously, because they were looking for the wrong mechanism. So yeah, that's why we get interglacial warming. So that's the whole paper, 36 pages of the paper in 10 minutes. In summary, ice age cooling is caused, it's going to do it in twos now, is it? Okay, strange thing. Okay, ice age cooling is caused by orbital cycles, the great summers and great winters. Ice ages are maintained by ice albedo, the reflectivity of the white, bright white ice in the northern hemisphere. Ice ages are ended by dust, lowering that albedo, lowering the reflectivity, which allows sunlight absorption and warming. Dust is caused by CO2 deserts. CO2 deserts are caused by low CO2. Thus, low CO2 causes interglacial warming, not high CO2, which is the opposite of classical climate claims. Totally. And if this is true for paleoclimate, then perhaps it is true for the current climate. You remember all of those ice sheets covered in Chinese industrial dust? There could be alternative reasons for Arctic ice actually decreasing. It might not be due to CO2. It might be Chinese industrial. Remember, all of this decrease in Arctic ice is commensurate and correlated with the rise of China as an industrial nation. And China doesn't give a damn about emissions. So if CO2 is not causing present warming, there is no need for any net zero expenditure. All of this net zero, all of this extra money, all of this transition into renewables is being promoted by the CO2 alarmism. If CO2 is not actually causing, or is only causing a much smaller amount, according to Dr. John Christie of the UAH, University of Alabama, Huntsville, he said that the amount of warming we're getting from CO2 is 1/4 of what the IPCC are saying. So the effect has been exaggerated. Plus, net zero finance is being wasted. So what I want to show you now is how we're wasting money chasing this, net zero dream. So that's the end of that talk. There you go. There's a whole climate paper in 10 minutes. And you can download this. It's Modulation of Ice Ages by Dustin Albedo, free PDF online. So the next bit of the talk is beware the green fantasy. And here's a green fantasy. We've got an Elizabethan house with some technology on the right-hand side of it in a nice forest. Sounds wonderful. Let's all live like that. yeah, but we've got 70 million people on this tiny little island. We're not going to live like this. That is the green fantasy. But we've had lots of green fantasies. This is a good one, the solar road. This is in France, down in the Western Alps, this one. So the idea here was, if you're going to have solar energy, why cover your fields with all of these solar panels? Why don't we just cover the roads with solar panels? And then we can power our civilization from the road network. That's great, isn't it? Except it's a green fantasy, and this is what we have to be. We have to be very critical realists when we're looking at any of this expenditure. So what's the problem with the solar road? It's not angled at the sun. You've lost 50% of your energy straight away because the roads aren't angled towards the sun, especially when you live up at 52 degrees north, as we do. Roads are often shaded by trees and tall buildings. They're not like this one, which had all of the trees nicely cut down around it to get maximum energy from it. It gets scratched and dirty. The surface of this thing is basically glass. It's a silicate material. It will get scratched and dirty. The surface gets too hot. Solar panels have to be cooled. If they get too hot, they stop working. This one has no cooling underneath it, like you normally get on a solar panel, and so it overheated and stopped working. The LEDs were not visible. There's no point having a solar road if you're going to paint white lines all over it and yellow lines and God knows what. So the idea was you would put LED lights in the solar road for all your white lines and yellow lines and stop signs and whatever. But you couldn't see them in the daylight. Totally impossible. You can see them at night. Yeah, it works well at night. Yeah, it doesn't work during the daytime. What other problems do we get? It's hugely expensive. It's like 1,000 times more expensive than getting a normal road, which is little bits of rock covered in tar, and you just spread it on a road. Nice, cheap, simple, durable. This is covered in about 5 different layers of high-tech material and lots of electronics underneath it, which is a fire risk, of course, as well. But this is hugely expensive. Hugely, hugely expensive. You don't want to be making this as your road. It's very slippery. If you've ever been on one of those bridges made of glass, you know, where you can see down and see the drop underneath you, don't go down one of those when it's raining. This is basically a glass surface. It's hugely slippery. You don't want this as a road. It's not going to be very usable. It's easily broken. This one lasted 6 months, and it didn't have heavy traffic on it. You can imagine the state of our roads at present when it's just made of rock and tar. You imagine our roads being made of delicate electronics and then run some 60-ton trucks down them. Easily broken. It's not going to last 2 minutes. Produces little or no energy for all of these reasons, and therefore the heating elements did not work. There was this ridiculous idea that they would heat the road with heating elements underneath it so you wouldn't get ice and snow on it. But of course the heating elements used more energy than this ever produced as a solar panel. So they put some in a little supermarket down in France, which is sort of makes more sense because, you know, there's not so much traffic in a little car park. And then they boasted that in 1 year, the panels produced the equivalent of 7,000 hours of use for 5 cash registers in the store. 5 cash registers. A cash register uses about 45 watts. 7,000 hours is about 1 year, so it was about 1 year of worth of 5 cash registers going. Not including the fridges and the heating and the lighting and God knows what you want in a supermarket. It produced 1,600 kilowatt hours per year. And a normal house uses 3,500 kilowatt hours in a year. So it was producing less than a normal house would use in energy in 1 year. It's not going to work. But they got lots of grant money. They got 11 million euros for this little escapade. Okay, it wasn't our money, this was European money, but nevertheless, there's an awful lot of money being pumped into these green dreams, and it all comes out of your tax money, and very few of these ever work. The one that I like the best, which I think is more worrying, oh yes, beware the green fantasy. Yeah, especially as the government is throwing money at people to make these green fantasies. The Rolls-Royce hybrid jet, I don't know if you heard about this. They sort of scrubbed it from the internet and scrubbed it from the media because they didn't want anyone to hear about it. But this is the problem when you dangle money. And in this case, £58 million to Rolls-Royce and the same to Airbus. If you dangle money in front of someone, they're going to say, gimme, gimme, gimme. And I was a bit upset that Rolls-Royce, you know, someone with their gravitas, their technology, their knowledge, their understanding would actually go for this. But they did. Because you cannot make a hybrid aircraft. It's impossible. They must have known about this from the very, very start. So what did they claim? They said it was going to be cleaner and quieter than a standard jet aircraft. It was going to reduce CO2 by 70%. We're going to save the planet by having a hybrid aircraft. Yeah, no you're not. Okay, why are hybrids more efficient? We have all of these hybrid cars around and they seem to be, you know, everybody wants one. Why are hybrids more efficient? Well, they're only more efficient if you can have regenerative braking. So a hybrid will be more efficient if you're working in the centre of London, doing all of this stop-starting, and then you can have regenerative braking, which will recharge the battery and help you move off, and that makes you much more efficient. But in an aircraft, I used to fly this machine. This was one of the aircraft I used to fly, so I'm familiar with this aircraft. I know every last nut and bolt on this aircraft. In an aircraft, we don't go along at 35,000 foot and stop at a set of traffic lights and then move on again. There is no regenerative braking, so there is no bonus for aircraft to have a hybrid. You can have smaller engines. Oh, yes, so it's come up with a cross there. No, regenerative braking doesn't work. You can have smaller engines. That's how you can make a hybrid more efficient, which our hybrid cars are not really doing. They're not really true hybrids. A proper hybrid car should have a little tiny, like a 500cc motor in there, working all the time, charging up the battery. And yet most hybrids have a bigger engine than my diesel has. But if you can put smaller engines, you can get better efficiency. But you can't do that with this aircraft, because this aircraft used to run on 98% max power for takeoff and 95% max power in the cruise. So you cannot give it smaller engines to make it more efficient. So we'll put a cross by that one. Where's the other cross? Here we go. And hybrids are more efficient if you can run at constant RPM. ICE engines like running at constant RPM. None of this stop-start business within London, you know. But we do that anyway in aircraft. You don't go along in the cruise and just move the, you know, thrust levers all the time, you know, just for fun of it. An aircraft will run at constant RPM and constant power for hours on end. So there is no efficiency to be gained in having a hybrid. And I think you can see the problem with the hybrid here. Where do the passengers sit? All of that equipment in there is to operate 2 of the engines, not 4. This aircraft has got 4 engines. All of that equipment is a jet engine in the back here with a big exhaust out the back. And on this side, you can't see it, but there's a big air intake. And then you've got all of the hybrid technical equipment in the body there. Yeah, that's a problem. No passengers. So what are the problems with this aircraft? Which I told Rolls-Royce that this would not work when they first came out with this, when they first got the grant for this. I wrote and said, this is stupid. You can't do this. So what happened? It was too complex. Now, normally you get a jet engine, nice little jet engine. This is the ALF 505, no less, Lycoming engine. You get a jet engine and you have a jet engine and a propeller. Direct drive, like it's efficient, very efficient. Now, with the hybrid, we get all of this. So what does this mean? Well, J is for jet engine, of course. So we get jet engine, jet engine, gearbox, generator, rectifier, battery, inverter, electric motor, and then the propeller. Yeah, we got 6 stages of getting the energy from the jet engine down to the propeller. Each one of those stages will be losing efficiency. So the whole of the aircraft was too inefficient. You actually lose efficiency with a hybrid. You don't gain efficiency. It was too heavy. The engine was 4 times the weight. It's not a big deal so much with a car. As you know, all of these Teslas and so on are very, very heavy cars. But you can't do that with an aircraft. They are very weight sensitive. So it was too heavy. It was too hot. You got the engine stuck in the fuselage here. There is a reason we put engines out on the wing. It's safer, just in case they start burning, of course. You don't want an engine in the back of the fuselage start burning, you know. Spoil your day, that will. But also, the airflow will cool the engine. That's why engines are out on the wing. And they've got the engine stuck in the fuselage here because that was the only way they could organize this. And they couldn't cool it. It got too hot. Because every single one of these items here is putting out energy because they're inefficient. So, yeah, the fuselage was almost on fire. There was no room for any passengers. So these aircraft normally take 120 passengers. And in this aircraft, you could only get 20 at the front. So there's no room for any passengers. So they increased CO2 emissions by 400%. So the goal was, and it never got airborne, of course. Poor thing, it never got airborne. Now, come on, you're supposed to do something here. There we go. The claim on the grant submission, when they made this submission to the government to get 58 million of your pounds out of it, the claim was to reduce CO2 by 70%. They ended up increasing CO2 by 400%. And they will not give the initial application that they made to the government. I want to see what they actually put into it to see if they were talking nonsense or whether they were talking sense. But all of my freedom of information requests have been denied. So we don't know what they actually claimed they would do. And this is a good one. This is the last one. Beware the green fantasies, because they're all up to this. If you dangle money in front of corporations and companies and people, they'll all jump on the bandwagon, of course. This was another hybrid aircraft by EAG. I've got no idea who they are. And you can tell that this is a green fantasy. This is what they do. They put these little baubles to fool politicians, because politicians are not terribly bright. So they stuck solar panels on the top of it and across the top of the wing. It's got solar panels on it because that will sell this green fantasy to a politician. Those solar panels will produce 1/10,000th of the energy that this aircraft is using. Yeah, you would need a wing about 100 meters across, I think. I don't know. Yeah, this is an absolute absurdity. If you see solar panels stuck on something for no apparent reason, you know it's a glistening bauble to try and attract the media and attract politicians. This is a green fantasy. Luckily, this one didn't get off the drawing board. But the Rolls-Royce one, they actually built it. And they claimed to me they didn't spend all the money, but they actually built it and it couldn't get airborne. So it was a total failure. So that is the end of my little short talk. Beware the green fantasy. So, yeah. I don't know if there are any questions on this. Yeah, gentleman over there.
Hi. One of the things you don't appear to have covered specifically and it might fall into the context of green fantasies, I'm not sure, but comments on forestry, afforestation, particularly given that in this local area of outstanding natural beauty, a large taxpayer grant has been paid to take 200 acres of arable, very good arable farmland to plant a non-native conifer forest. But
yes.
What's your take on afforestation in the whole carbon argument?
They are totally confused about what they want to do. They want to rewild the environment, which will stop people making agriculture, which they're complaining about because they're saying people are starving because there is less food because of climate change. But yes, that's because you've actually rewilded half of the country. So you've got less food in the first place. Then they're planting the trees so that Drax can cut them down and burn them in Drax power station. So the whole idea is totally confused. What do you want? Do you want energy from bios or do you want food? You can't have both, you know. There's only a certain amount of sunlight will fall on a small country like Britain. So yeah, they've got no idea what they want to do. And I have to say, this business of planting a tree is ridiculous in the first place. Trees will only take up CO2 until they die. And then what do you do with it? Unless you bury it in the ground, that CO2 is going to come straight back out again. You're either going to burn that wood, like in Drax power station, or you're going to use that wood in a house or something, but then it will rot away gently over 100 years, and all of that CO2 will go straight back into the atmosphere. So planting a tree to offset your CO2 is only an offset for 50 years, maybe 100 years if you're lucky. So it's a CO2 offset. It's not getting rid of CO2 unless you bury the tree. Yeah, but that's what nature did. That's called the Carboniferous era. That's when the coal beds were laid down and the oil fields were laid down. I don't know if you know this, but the reason the Carboniferous era ended was because of mushrooms. And all life on Earth was saved by mushrooms. Hooray for the mushrooms. Let's have, round of applause for the mushrooms. What was happening was all of the trees were growing and dying and laying down the coal beds into the ground and storing away all of the CO2 in the whole of the Earth. And so that CO2 levels came down to a point where all life on Earth was going to die. And that would have been a problem. There would be no life on Earth. But very luckily, at that time, the mushrooms learnt how to eat trees. And the mushrooms came along and started eating the trees and returning some of that CO2 into the atmosphere. So they saved all life on Earth. That's the interplay we have with CO2 in the environment. So hooray for the mushrooms. Okay, thanks very much. Thank you.